all of a sudden I feel like I'm on the margins here, right? Like I'm being asked to justify why newspapers or radio stations or whatever, why journalists shouldn't be being paid by the government, right? When you think about it, like it's a that's such a blatant conflict of interest. And they can, like I've had dozens of journalists say to me, "Oh, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my work." And I'm like, "I don't care. What it does is it affects people's faith in your work, right? You can be pure as the driven snow in how you present yourself, which very few of them are, but nevertheless, even if you are, no one's going to believe you because your salary is being subsidized. You probably wouldn't have a job without the government in power. And we expect you to hold that government in power to account, and we can't possibly see how you can do that."
Hello there and welcome. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, our in-house public policy podcast. Today, we are here to talk about the future of the CBC and the news media landscape in Canada. Just a little bit of context for you. The federal election looming, the fate of the CBC seems to hang in the balance as private media organizations complain about unfair competition and many Canadians about its perceived political bias. The official opposition, the Conservatives here in Canada, are vowing to slash funding for the 88-year-old Broadcasting Corporation, and the ruling Liberal government, meanwhile, warns that cuts to the CBC will severely harm Canadian culture and leave Canadians at the mercy of fake news. And caught in the middle are taxpayers who pay $1.4 billion annually to keep the Mother Corp afloat in both languages. I'm quoting here from the intro to a paper on the CBC by the author who we have here with us today, Peter Menzies, a prolific writer and author. We can't keep up with all of his output. He is an MLI Senior Fellow. He is a past publisher of the Calgary Herald and a former vice chair of the Canadian Radio Television Commission, the CRTC for short. Peter, thanks so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure, as always. Good to see you.
Great. Well, let's dive in. Some of the background here. The CBC's been around for quite some time now, and its mandate has changed along with its purview and broadcast and its reporting mediums. Tell us a bit about the CBC's history in Canada up to the present day.
Well, the CBC came about through legislation beginning through the Aird Commission in 1929, because the politicians of the day, that would be the Bennett government, were concerned that Canada would be flooded with U.S. broadcasters. NBC had opened a station in Toronto, for instance. Plus, there were some controversial broadcasts made by private broadcasters. The head of the Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada was doing regular smackdowns on the Roman Catholic bishops and leaders of mainstream Protestant churches. That wasn't popular, and a radio station in Saskatoon was broadcasting speeches by the U.S. Ku Klux Klan leader. So this legislation was introduced that led to the creation of the CBC. Initially, which doesn't get mentioned much, the idea was that this new corporation would actually take over all the private stations, and there would only be the CBC, which has led to a sort of institutional cultural view that, the CBC mandate should cover as much things as everything, and then the private sector simply exists to pick up what the CBC can't do. This is a point of tension that hasn't disappeared within the broadcasting culture.
Yeah, and one thing I think you note, in your writing often is that it's a very different country at that time. Much smaller, so a different approach to cultivating business or creating national organizations was it was suited to another time, and times have changed significantly. What are some of the more recent developments in the CBC's history?
Oh boy. Well, the CBC went from its original role as being actually both regulator and broadcaster, and a lot of countries did this initially because governments were very, very concerned about radio in the same way they express alarm about the internet these days. It was very powerful, and they, as governments always do, they worry that there might be a little too much democracy and people might not have people would get fake news and that sort of stuff. As it's developed over the years, obviously the private sector grew much stronger. The CBC's very central role is not the same as it once was. There are multiple sources of news available, both cable and lately online to people. So the idea that the CBC would be your major source has sort of disappeared. It still is a major source in French, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later, and it still is a primary source because there aren't a lot of private sector sources outside of a couple FM radio stations up north. But in what you call the rest of Canada, it's uh, still probably the largest single entity, but it is not in a majority position as it once was.
Hmm, right. Okay. So yes, very good. Emerged in a very different context, is now facing a much larger country, new mediums of publication and consumption of news and entertainment. CBC does a lot these days. What are the main problems facing it? Um, what the way you lay things out in the paper, especially going through the history, the CBC wasn't always accused of undue bias, which it is by some. I would say a significant proportion of Canadians today, and that also, as you've just noted, it plays a very significant role in the media landscape, and is perhaps crowding out or creating a media landscape that is heavily dependent on government subsidies. Um, what are these problems? To have that right? And what is the broad approach to remedying the situation that you propose?
Well, in terms of its subsidies, we should point out that in the 1990s, the under Finance Minister Paul Martin, the Chrétien government imposed the deepest cuts, financial cuts, budget cuts in the CBC's history, and it prompted a lot of rationalization of spending. Like when I was back in those days, I was working in media, and we used to make fun of how many CBC people could show up to a single press conference, right? So there'd be the local, there'd be CBC Calgary, CBC National, then one in French and one in English, then one in English radio, and there could be 7 different CBC people and 4 cameramen and God knows how many sound men at a single news conference. But more to your point, in the last 10 years particularly, journalism has wandered away from general objectives like objectivity, which came in vogue for most of, but not all, of the 20th century. The CBC has been not immune to that, and there have been some key points in its history. Most probably, they're suing over the Conservative Party for a copyright violation in the dying days of the 2019 election. Really inflamed conservatives against them. It was, in my view, inexcusable, unexplained, and it failed very quickly once it got to court. And that was a sort of display of institutional bias, I think, that was very vital, very much framed the discussion in recent years, because you can pick away at individual stories and find bias, proving, and you can have a sense of overall bias. Uh, Proving the institutional bias is very easily shrugged off. I was on I've had people quote back to, I've seen Richard Sturzberg recently sort of said, well, I did a study in 2009, and it showed that we were pretty even handed. And Chris Waddle, I was talking to the other day, pointed to a study in 2006 that showed that Liberals felt the CBC was too biased towards the Conservatives in that election. Conservatives felt they were soft on Liberals. Those don't really matter anymore, partly because they're like 15, 16, and 20 years old. And you can always come up with those. And I think it's really important for media when they do get accusations of bias, not so much, from the political parties themselves, but from the general public that they are supposed to serve, that they take them seriously. And I'm not convinced we ever did in the business take them seriously. Reporters back in my day would just shrug and say, "Oh, people don't really know what they want." There's a certain uh, defensiveness that isn't, yes, we know better sort of thing. That, I know I'm not biased. Well, prove it, right? It's something that journalists have to start every day doing. No matter what, we all have our own inherent biases, but that doesn't mean that the work you that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to produce work that is without evidence of bias. So that's the CBC's problem, and also it's become very centralized. It's commercial. It sells ads. It's trying to compete with CNN, and so it's become this hybrid publicly funded commercial broadcaster in terms of television and online, which is also a point of great controversy and has angered private news organizations.
Okay. Okay, so we'll come back to bias and some of the trends over the 20th century in that regard. But the other problem you point out is kind of its funding model, and then the news media ecosystem that is almost derivative of the size and weight of the CBC and the amount of funding it gets. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think you can deal with the CBC without dealing with it as a part of the entire news ecosystem, and that's where we come in terms of the paper. We constantly get these discussions about what should we do with the CBC. 1 in 3 Canadian journalists works for the CBC. It is a very, very large organization. It, you know, C to C to C, that sort of stuff. So the idea, like, came up in outgoing heritage ministers Pascal Saint-Onge's proposal that you could add another 1.1 billion to the CBC. It's amazing to me that people could do that without stopping to think, okay, what will that do to the rest of the industry, right? Okay, if we have one, if we can add a reporter in Brooks, Alberta, great. What does that do to the existing media in Brooks, right? Does it kill it? Do we end up with a more vibrant or a worse media ecosystem in Brooks? Or pick a country. The Department of Heritage in recent years has shown very little understanding of the internet and what we're and the huge transition that we're going through in the way we communicate. And I think with the CBC, that's the big issue. So if we're going to move forward and have a healthy news ecosystem, the question we come down to, what do we have to put, what are we looking for? What are we aspiring to? And how can the CBC be useful in that? Or how can it evolve in terms of that? And my solution, at least with English CBC, excluding the far north and Francophone, is to have it become a primarily subscription service and not sell advertising. To me, it sounds, I guess it sounds a little radical, but it's also perfectly rational. And we're going through a period of radical change. And I think some radical solutions, or if people want to call them radical solutions, I don't really, are required. We need to make some big changes, and switching to subscription basis. If people want to pay for the CBC and support it, they can. If they don't want to, they won't.
Okay. Yeah, let's get to those solutions. But before we do, I just want to make sure we paint the picture of how much funding the CBC receives from taxpayers, and then also the subsidy landscape in the rest of the news media environment. So it receives 1.4 billion annually from taxpayers, and then it has revenue from other sources, advertising, things you've mentioned. What do you see the relationship between that public funding being and its ability to remain impartial in its reporting? And then with respect to private media, their dependence similarly on government subsidies, is that affecting impartiality and trust in the media? And I know you've just mentioned subscriptions, so another model, but do you think it's time for subsidies to end or be phased out, for both the CBC and or the rest of the news media industry?
Yeah, I think subsidies and government subsidies and media are um, inherently bad. There's no way that, and this is not like some new view. It's, this was a very this was a view held almost entirely across the spectrum until like 5 or 6 years ago, and all of a sudden I've been, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, all of a sudden I feel like I'm on the margins here, right? Like I'm being asked to justify why newspapers or radio stations or whatever, why journalists shouldn't be being paid by the government, right? When you think about it, like that's such a blatant conflict of interest. And they can, like I've had dozens of journalists say to me, "Oh, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my work." And I'm like, "I don't care. What it does is it affects people's faith in your work, right? You can be pure as the driven snow in how you present yourself, which very few of them are, but nevertheless, even if you are, no one's going to believe you because your salary is being subsidized, actually paid. You probably wouldn't have a job without the government in power. And we expect you to hold that government in power to account, and we can't possibly see how you can do that under these circumstances. And those who are ignoring that are simply whistling past the graveyard, because otherwise what you end up with is this facade of media, right? You're subsidizing the production of news. And because you're successfully subsidizing the production of news and successfully subsidizing the employment of journalists, you think you found success. No one is measuring whether anybody's reading it, right? So, I mean, if you're going to subsidize anything, I've always said you don't subsidize production, you subsidize consumption. So if you want to really subsidize, if government wants to take an active role, and I mean, I think there's a good case to be made that it is in the public interest that citizens have a shared set of facts that you know that inform their lives and that they can use to organize their lives and their opinions about the world. How they get that is less important than they get it. But if you want to subsidize it, you do it by having your subscriptions tax deductible, fully tax deductible, or primarily tax deductible, at least at the level of a political party. Um, and then the consumer chooses which media they want to spend that benefit on, rather than the government deciding. The government is in a position right now where it is not just it can be subsidizing bad journalism,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Because
and there's no check on it. There's no
there's no
consumer
check
check on it. Yeah.
there's no consumer check on it, right? So if I have, if I have the Toronto Star, National Post, and the Globe and Mail to choose from, I don't want necessarily to buy them all, but I might if they present me with the proper value proposition. Like that's old fashioned business thinking, right? The consumer and the product, right? Make that connection. So anyway, to get the main point is that we need to get rid of all forms of direct subsidy to news organizations if we wish to restore trust in media so that people can trust the set of facts they are presented with by media and and have some better chances of maintaining social cohesion.
Mhm. Very good. Clearly stated. We know what needs to end with respect to the funding sources, and you've got some proposals how to address that, subscription-based models, consumer-driven media. Before we do that, though, you break it up your recommendations in the paper regionally, because there are different parts of the CBC. There's Radio Canada, there's the North, there's CBC News in English. So starting with CBC North, you suggest that they should continue to be publicly funded until it becomes market supported. Can you elaborate on why it's so important for CBC North to remain publicly funded? And maybe before we start, Peter, I should say, can you just say briefly what you recommend for each of the markets, and then talk
Sure.
about
For CBC North, the recommendation is largely status quo as markets develop, although continuing to merge all the broadcasting assets and the online assets into purely online, because that's where the future is going. That's a matter of connectivity, though, which we'll touch on. For Francophone, it's popular. It serves a purpose. I think it's there's a strong argument that can be made in favor of the fact that having a voice that is speaking to Francophone Canadians, Quebecers in particular, because that's where the majority of them live, that informs them about Canada, I think is very important, so that we don't become overly insular. And there's some recommendations I make there regarding the manner in which Radio Canada, through its assets in French language assets there, manages itself, so that Quebecers are better informed about Canada, its history, and their role in it. You can tell the truth, and you can still have separatists make their argument in your news stories and that sort of stuff. You have to be fair in terms of that, but supplying Quebec in particular with more information about the rest of Canada, I think, is a strong public good argument. At the same time, going forward, the idea of having subsidies, subscriptions and donations available is a field that could be developed, as seeing how this next recommendation works. In terms of the English language assets, strong recommendation that its role is far too disruptive within the news ecosystem. It's making it grow, and even having it as it is, it's just sort of imagine any other industry trying to be healthy when you have the largest single player in the industry receiving a massive government subsidy every year. Like, would you go into the fast food business if McDonald's was getting a $1.5 billion subsidy so it could give its burgers away practically for free, while you're trying to get out there and convince people to buy yours? It just doesn't work. So we need to move away from that government subsidized model. And without you don't have to destroy the CBC when you do that, because if you do take the funding away, it would cease to exist, but you have to replace it with something. So I think, you got 15 million homes in Canada. If, I used the figure $30 a month, you could use 10 or something else if you wanted. If people subscribe to that, that would be roughly $300 a year, which is, a newspaper subscription these days. You could raise $5.4 billion. That's the size of the market that's out there. If the CBC were just to get 10% of that, they would have $540 million of subscriber revenue. And they should be able to function quite nicely on that, and could move ahead into the future as a new company and a valued and contributing member of the Canadian news ecosystem.
Very good. Yeah. So a nuanced set of recommendations based on, particular realities facing each language set and region and media ecosystem in the country. But the idea is to, over time, for all aspects of CBC, get them away from subsidies and move more towards subscription-based focus.
I think that's generally I'd like to see everything move towards a subscription-based focus, because that's how I think the news media ecosystem can survive in the long run. It's very difficult to sell something somebody else is giving away for free. And in terms of the North, I think people have to be very aware that, when it comes to solving sovereignty disputes, connectivity is one of the measures that is used.
Right.
You have a very sparse population,
Yeah.
roughly 100,000 people, maybe a little more, spread over a territory that is larger than all of Europe,
Yeah.
right? So you can't, you can't, like I said,
Just abandon.
market forces, economic market forces simply don't exist. People consume goods there, but primarily they are citizens, and
Mhm.
they deserve to be connected to the
Mhm.
rest of the country. They're and we um, uh, should be looking out for them,
Mhm.
because that is our land. It's our territory, and it's filled with natural resources,
Mhm.
which, as we've learned recently, other people are eyeing, and that we have failed to develop, and it's going to grow.
Mhm. So, thinking about some possible responses and rejoinders to this idea of subscription-based service, what would be some of the main challenges of moving to a system like that? Presumably it would create more competition, but could it also potentially lead to greater fragmentation in the media landscape? Does how this get rolled out really crucial to its success and obviously the public and political response?
I think so. I mean, I think there would be obviously some pushback, because it's something new,
Mhm.
but it's not something horrible, right? That in terms of that, I was on CBC show the other day, on last week, and in Alberta at noon,
Mhm.
and I brought up the subject, right, when we were
Mhm.
discussing the future of the CBC. I didn't um, unveil my master plan
Right.
from this paper, but I did. Kathleen Petty's the host, and I've known Kathleen for close to 40 years.
Mm.
Um, and I said, why don't we ask people if they'd be willing to pay a subscription to the CBC? Now, there were only three, it's a phone in show, so there were only three callers that we had the opportunity to address the
Not a
question
sufficient
to.
sample size,
But
but
no, but they're all CBC fans. I mean,
yeah,
this
yeah,
is a
right.
midday CBC show. The people
Yeah,
listening to it are fans of the CBC.
right.
Um, no one said no. Um, they said they would. Um, One said that she would do it, but she'd resent doing it. And I can get
Yeah.
that. But if you really value, even if you're getting joy from the system, and you enjoy the value proposition that it presents,
Yeah.
and radio is reasonably popular, so this was a radio show.
Mhm.
Um, uh, people will step up, and like I said, well, I mean, like I said, you can juggle the numbers any way you want, but
Right.
if you look at $30 a month, if 10%, only 10% of Canadian households
Yeah.
chipped in $30 a month, it's doable. There are examples in Canada. CKUA Radio in Alberta
Mhm.
raises money through fundraising drives. It's commercially licensed, but it's largely a public uh, radio station. I,
Mhm.
I got to know some of the operators of it reasonably well, and it used to have government funding,
Mhm.
but then the Alberta government stepped away from that funding. And the guys running it said it actually, they didn't like it at first, but they thought in the long run it helped, because now they were more sensitive to their listeners,
Hmm.
right? So when you've got a lot of sort of volunteer um, part-time DJs on a Friday night. So if you
Right.
wanted to have somebody who played, if somebody was on there who wanted to play jazz music, right? They couldn't just play the jazz that they wanted to play. They
Right.
had to play jazz that people wanted to listen to. So you became
Mhm.
more responsive, and that's what helps their fundraising. So if
Mhm.
you're responsive to your audience,
Mhm.
you should be able to do that. It would be
Mhm.
it would take it's not a transition you can do in 1 year.
Right.
You have to set that up. You have to set up different corporate entities. You have to set up a program to do it, and you have to ease your way out of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but I have no reason to believe that it's not doable. Although in a country that thinks of government subsidy as a solution to almost every problem, that might be uh, it might take some dedication to push that
Right.
through.
Fair, yeah, I mean, it's not like, people's desire for news media is going to go away, but, yeah, it has to be done, smartly and prudently. Um, but this I mean, this was part of the logic earlier on, as you've kind of recounted CBC's history in a much smaller country, that it requires some level of government support to get fledgling industries off the ground and keep them unique and outside of the influence of our big increasingly belligerent neighbor to the south. This is one of the arguments you hear about in the news media and in the entertainment um, industries in Canada, right? Is that, oh, to preserve uniquely Canadian content and industry, they need this level of government intervention. What do you think about that type of argument in this particular case applied to the CBC or to the broader media and entertainment ecosystems?
I don't think the goal is unreasonable. I mean, I think you want, you know, like I worked in the newspaper industry, and the whole idea of Canadian content that we'd see go on in the broadcasting industry was bizarre. We produced local content and we produced heavily Canadian content. We covered international news, of course, and some American news when it mattered to our readers. But we did it because that's what the market wanted, right? They wanted to know about their world. Um, my the problem is in how the CRTC world has developed goes back to the discussion about what are you subsidizing. So the CRTC set up a regime where it says if you want a radio license, 30% or 40%. I can't remember what it's at right now. Most of them are at 40% because they requested it to get the license. It must be Canadian music, right? And I have a big problem with that, right? Because you're providing people with an opportunity. People can argue about that, but primarily you ended up going to the big cable companies and that, and saying, okay, 5% of your revenues have to go in to support Canadian content, the Canada Media Fund, film and television production. So what you ended up was funding the production of it. So everybody involved in that system thinks it's a success, but nobody in the real world outside of that can name more than one or two Canadian actors based in Canada, or one or two programs that they've watched that they think are a hit. I mean, I heard somebody mention in an advertisement the other day, Schitt's Creek. There's nothing explicitly Canadian about Schitt's Creek, right? It meets Canadian content standards, but it actually hides the idea that it's in Canada, right? So that it can it can sell its product in the United States. So I think that system has, um, that emperor has no clothes. In terms of having defended the culture and enriched the culture, it hasn't. Canadian university sports can't get on our sports broadcasters, which are just filled with US college sports all the time, right? So everybody's, you ask what's your favorite football team? It's either the Miami Dolphins or the Chicago Bears, or, what's your favorite college team? It's Notre Dame or Boston College or UCLA or something. Nobody says University of Toronto, right? Nobody, Canadian university hockey is every bit as good, I think, as NCAA hockey. Recently in the Saddle Dome, the U of C, both men's and women's teams played against their crosstown rivals, Mount Royal University. There were 14,000 people in the Saddle Dome. Did you even see a highlight of that on our broadcasters? So no. So these are the failures that have occurred, so that we are actually, I think, that, we've created a system to defend ourselves against American content, but everybody's watching CNN and MSNBC, right? And down east, and not watching CTV News Live or CBC News Network or anything like this. Sooner or later, somebody's got to say out loud that this system has failed to achieve those objectives, and we got to look at new ways of doing it. So that's where I'm thinking something more audience-based for the CBC. It's not That's what I'm thinking. That's what my sort of analysis came down to, is that we've got to move we've got to try something new, because and in terms of subsidies, we've got to look to subsidizing the consumer, the consumption of the product, rather than rather than that. So if we go to CBC with a subsidization model or subscription model, people should remember that, in my plan anyway, um, not it might cost them a little bit of money, but that would be something they could deduct from their taxes.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, well said. Strength does not come from just receiving handouts, but from consumer responsiveness, and there's a lot of opportunity for the introduction of that into the CBC and news media's
Well,
business models.
we're at risk right now because the solution to the news industry in general, right, is struggling
Yeah,
because of the shift in internet
that's what
advertising
I
and
want to
everything,
talk about.
and
Yeah.
and our solution has been to subsidize them too, right?
Mhm.
So if we keep going down that road, all we have everybody's CBC, right?
Yeah, well, you mentioned this earlier, Peter, that the CBC and other, I guess, news media in Canada maybe haven't been as responsive and adaptable to the new internet-based forms of communication and content creation, consumption. How do you think it can address these sorts of things? What are the main recommendations that you propose to help move, aspects of the CBC and perhaps the rest of the news media industry to more digital internet based media production and consumption?
Sure. If I mean, everybody people have been trying to do this for years, and in 2016, Philip Crawley was, the publisher of the Globe and Mail, appeared before uh, the I think it was, House of Commons, I think it was the Heritage Committee, it could have been the Finance Committee, encouraging them it was Heritage, encouraging them to not allow CBC online, or at least not allow the CBC to sell ads online, because all the newspapers were trying to transition to being digital, right? So, and he did, and he later, in another appearance, he explained how the Globe was able to change its business model from its revenue model from 70% advertising and 30% subscriptions to 70% subscriptions and 30% advertising. Now, the total is still a lot less than it used to be at one point, but it is a model that, you look at the UK, they've had to go through a similar transition, in terms of digital. Newspapers like the Times, the Telegraph has gone through some really tough times. The Guardian too, but the Guardian has a voluntary subscription, right? So they just ask people, kind of like Wikipedia, right? They just ask people, but they're getting enough that they're actually making money again, right? And the Telegraph's gone through a tough time. As they, one of the guys from the Spectator told a British, I think it was the Scottish Parliament committee, that they didn't want any government help because they've gone to hell and back the last few years to sort of get through this. He described it as being like being on he felt like he was on the Bataan death march, at times, and they've lost a lot of people along the way, but they've come out the other side. They've figured it out, right? Whereas so there are other places that do that. The New York Times seems to have been able to make a reasonable transition and become a global product. We just, I think, as soon as we started getting subsidized, and when we were originally looking for subsidies, it was only supposed to be for a short term. It looks like we stopped trying, right? And there are examples of this working in many places around. The Wall Street Journal never gave away itself for free, right? And it you can only read that through a subscription. And but if you want to be informed about business and the financial world, you have to buy one. Right. So I think as we move the CBC shifting to subscriptions will make it easier for others to shift to subscriptions, subscription. And let's not forget that 30, 35 years ago, the newspaper industry was selling people subscriptions all the time, right? I mean, back in this is kind of at that point where everything's back in the day, but you go back to the 1990s, 1994 something, I looked it up, you could, subscription to the Ottawa Citizen would cost $200 a year. People paid it because they valued the information. There was more information in it than just news, but then we went through a period of time when it was given away for free, right? And that was a bad idea. So recognize that it was a bad idea and let's return to a subscription model. Will everybody subscribe? No. But did they ever? No. Even in the heyday of newspapers, not everybody bought a subscription, maybe, it's not like it happened. Most people happily go through their lives not consuming a lot of news. They kind of pop their head up every now and then when there's an election and look around. But they go about, they go to work, they come home, they take their kids to piano lessons, or they take them to hockey practice, or they go play soccer, and then they eat, and then they go sleep, and they repeat, right? I mean, they don't have time for the nonsense that preoccupies goofs like us, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, very interesting point. Yeah, and we've got a lot of attractive proposals to consider here. I want to come back to what you think the prospects are for, some of these things actually being taken up by, the future government in Canada. But before I do so, I want to return to this question of bias and trust in the media. It's one thing for the CBC. You've kind of noted how the increasing reliance on the public purse and some trends in journalism and more like intellectual views broadly in society have contributed to that. But it's a society-wide problem, in Western culture, I want to say, other parts of the world as well. Media trust, perceived bias, it seems like it has worsened over the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years. I link some of these things back to postmodernism in particular, in the 70s, the kind of revolutionary social justice spirit of challenging norms, and postmodernism of, kind of rejecting the idea of concepts of objectivity and, leaning into your bias. So my question, Peter, is do you think this media bias and trust issue is broader than just, what we're facing, particularly in Canada, with how it's funded and set up? And and what do you make of that characterization that, some of these trends have been driving further distrust and bias in media?
Yeah, that's a big area. So I'll try to break it into some smaller digestible bits. First of all, just for historical purposes, people should know that newspapers, which were until the 1920s, that they were our media, were historically very biased. They would
Yellow
be,
journalism,
William
right?
Randall. Well, yeah, the guys created them to promote a cause, right? I mean, they created them to make money too, but they were generally promoting a cause. So they were pretty blatantly, this was the Tory
Mhm.
paper, this was the Labor paper, the Liberal paper, the Democratic paper, the Republican paper, that sort of stuff. In the 1920s, when they started to be able to attract more advertising, and there was some other reasons for it doing too, but the primary driver was when they realized they could make money by display advertising, and not just classified, which had driven it, but by more advertising. They began to push to be less
Mhm.
partisan, right? And so the push for more objective, at least fair and balanced news, um, sort of came on because you could make more money if you had not just conservatives read your paper, you could have liberals read your paper too, right? So that was the driver. That persisted for most of the 20th century, although as you've pointed out, I mean there were times when bias was sort of became dominant again. During the Second World War, our Canadian reporters in Europe were not seeking out comment from the Germans, right? to to be, but those are extreme situations. There is the communist anti-communist movement and concerns there in the 1950s with the nuclear Armageddon, hanging over our heads every day. And then the Vietnam War became more real because people actually got to see war on the night news, not just read about it in the paper. And also, like you said, there have been sort of intellectual trends like postmodernism that challenged the idea that there was any such thing as objective truth. Which, whether you agree with that or not, that doesn't mean that you can't achieve objective journalism, and let the reader find the truth in that. But I think that movement infected journalism schools to a good degree, so that journalists themselves began to abandon the idea of objectivity, and in some cases be taught to embrace their bias, right? And this became very big after Trump was first elected in 2016, when journalists felt, oh my God, if we were doing our job, he never would have been elected, right? And you can that's a big discussion there. But the other thing I think is in terms of this trust issue, and this is where the internet comes into it. Is, I used this anecdote years ago. There was a time when I was working. I think I was assistant news editor at the Calgary Herald, and it was 11 o'clock at night. The first edition was long gone, and some story appeared out of Africa that looked of significance. And I wanted to get it in the paper for the second edition, right? And my boss, a dear man, who I really taught me a lot, and I really enjoyed working with, at the time was, he was tired. We all were. It's sort of the end of the day, and he said, Peter, just don't worry about it tonight. No one knows what doesn't get in the paper, right? And he was right. And then no one knew what didn't get in the paper
back then.
back then. Now everybody knows what doesn't get in the paper because you've got the internet out there, right? So that's placed news organizations in a much more uncomfortable position where, I mean, you've got things like recently the reports that occurred in the UK regarding the transgender issues and that sort of thing that were not reported in Canada, right? But well, I mean, there were some instances, but very little, and it's often not referred to, and it's kind of like, but everybody is reading, right? You can, well, not everybody is, but
Yeah, exactly. Not everybody.
enough people are reading, like it's on the BBC, it's in the Guardian, right? It's in credible news organizations everywhere. Other countries are making changes and that sort of stuff, and they're watching as Canadian news organizations are displaying what I think, in that instance at least, is a blatant bias of omission, right? They are ignoring a story of which they must be aware because they're afraid to publish it, or they just don't want to for their own ideological reasons. How do you maintain public trust when you practice journalism in that fashion, right? I mean, nobody's asking you to agree with these reports or agree with these actions or promote them in any way. People are just asking you to do your job and inform us, right? So Canada sits here pretending none of this other stuff is going on. Well, public policy changes are being made and these are not like crazy right-wing countries. Norway, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, right? You go on, and we miss those things. So now people know what doesn't get in the paper, and that has, or on your news platform, particularly when you have the ability digital, right? You can still post those stories, right? It's not like you're running out of pages to put them in like you used to with a newspaper. It was, if I was going to put that story from Africa in, I had to take another one out, right? So anyway, I think, and that's affected a lot of things. Some of it is quite justifiable. when you're looking at credible news sources. Some of it is less so. When you're looking at, some sort of wacky conspiracy theories and that sort of stuff, and you see them on all ends of the spectrum. But those existed before, and I am somewhat more optimistic on that sense. I think most people can have a pretty good sense of what's sensible. There are some that for sure don't, uh, but I think typically they would be subject to the social and intellectual suasion of their peers. Um, and, but one of the things, just to go tricky things here too, we're almost reversing back to those days of blatant bias, right? Because people are giving, or people, publishers or news organizations are more and more giving up. I think it appears to be. I can't prove this, but anecdotally, giving up on the idea of serving everybody, right? So you just decide, here, people who are center left to left, there's a good market for this. So I'm just going to do that, right? So if you're the Toronto Star, you do not carry conservative commentary on your pages, right? Um, and you just go for that market. If you're the National Post, you do not carry um, liberal socialist commentary on your pages, right? You just go for that conservative market. So we're almost going back to that, and the idea of those sort of central newspapers like the Ottawa Citizen, the Calgary Herald, Edmonton Journal used to do, is that if you went on the op-ed pages, you would get a good variety of opinion. Um, uh, that's kind of gone. And so the CBC, in a sense, is stuck in that position too. What do you serve, right? You look at the polls and you say 60% of Canadians are inclined to be, left of center. That's what you end up serving. Does that make the other 40% deeply unhappy? Yes. Do you care? Right?
Yeah, it's so you can
You
understand it.
right.
Well, and I
That's
think
where
you can
you end
also
up.
empathize with your recounting here of just how rapidly things have changed in the the mediums of publication and consumption, that the legacy media in some sense has been slow to catch up to the fact that, yes, like, people are going to find out about what's not covered. And I hope that, because there is a real public good function here provided by news media that do their due diligence, that aim for standards of objectivity, fairness, and balance, and I hope that it will return. But I think you agree as well that for a public, national broadcaster, they do have a, especially when their mandate indicates as such, they do have a responsibility to be fair and balanced, to a degree, right? And when there's a large part of the population that they may not be serving, something might need to
No,
change there. Yeah,
we there's an expectation. I mean, this is where you get back to public funding. If you are taking my money, I expect to be served,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And no matter what my perspective, right?
right.
So I need you to serve me. I won't agree with everything you do, but I need to
Yeah,
feel
that's fine.
overall that I'm being well served. And that's
Hmm.
that's why that relationship between the consumer and right with a public broadcaster, that's the whole point.
Hmm.
You're trying to serve everybody. It's a big ask,
Yeah.
particularly in a country as geographically big
Mhm,
and much more diverse than CBC thinks. So,
mhm,
um, yeah, if you are not doing that, you are failing. So maybe you should do something else.
mhm, mhm. Very good. Well, I've kept you a long time, Peter, but we can't let you leave without giving your forecast about how some of these measures you've proposed might be adopted. What might be some of the public or political responses in different scenarios as we're approaching, a federal election here sometime soon. What do you think? What's on the horizon for us?
I think nothing will change. I mean, there's a good chance should the Conservatives win a majority, I think something will change. I think at the moment that seems less likely than it did a few weeks ago, but at the same time, we're in this sort of afterglow thing with the new leader where Pierre Poilievre can't get his message out at all, and all the headlines are Carney, Carney, Carney. Nobody really knows the guy, but there's some push there. I think if Carney wins, I don't think it'll be a priority for him at all. I think the way his platform is unfolding so far, it looks like he has bigger issues to deal with than the CBC, and it would probably just stay as it is, right? It would be just become an issue to be managed in the background. No point in causing any problems or distractions there. For the Conservatives, I think Poilievre has a promise to keep to his supporters, so that if they win, I think he would move forward with his plan to defund the CBC. I took a look at that in my paper, and that there is no way you can take $1 billion out of the CBC and just leave it there without just killing it, right? So if you want to just kill it, then just kill it, right? But I don't think there's a strong policy argument for that. There might be a political argument for it, but I think the policy argument um, uh, is to transition it so that it becomes refunded and becomes a new separate company, so that you don't have to shut down all those newsrooms. You don't have to shut down, unemploy all those people. You might want to sell the building on Front Street, and a whole bunch of different things like that to get some of the money to do some of the things. There might be some job losses, but I would encourage them to take a look at my proposal as a way to make things work, because you're going to have to retain CBC North, I think, and Radio Canada. But it's in the hands of the gods at the moment. So
Well, very good, Peter. Thank you for that. It's yeah, visionary set of proposals that are also pretty fine-grained in the detail you go into, and we do hope that one way or another, politicians, policymakers, and Canadians who are interested in the future of their news media ecosystem take a look at this piece. Peter, thanks for joining us. This is being Peter Copeland here with Inside Policy Talks. Thanks for listening.
thanks.